Actually, you know what? Let's turn back a couple chapters because I want to read a little bit here, just by way of just a little grab a little context here for what we're going to read this morning. So go back to chapter 21, and I want to read just a few verses here. And I don't know we've covered all this, but it'll be good just by way of a reminder for what Paul is going to say here in our text this morning. But in Acts chapter 21, Paul he's made his way to Jerusalem. He's told the church of all that's been going on with him and the Gentile churches he's been starting and being a part of. And then James stands up and tells them, listen, there's been some worries. There's been some concerns by the Jews here that you are essentially kind of causing Jews everywhere you go to kind of forsake their heritage, essentially. And so he tells them this. He says in verse 24 of chapter 21, so take therefore and purify thyself with them, these men who have a vow, in verse 23, take thyself and purify with them, be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads and know these things whereof that they were informed concerning thee, that they're nothing. But that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law, as touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing. And then verse 26, Paul took the men the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be made. Verse 27, and when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people. Look at that. They stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, men of Israel, help. This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, against the law, against this place, and further brought Greeks into the temple and hath polluted this holy place. And then go back to chapter 24. And just quickly, we see this is the Sanhedrin making their case against Paul before Felix, and they hire this man Tertullus to come, and starting really in verse 5 to get past kind of all the flattery that he said. Verse 5, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. And so let's pick it up here in verse 10 for our text this morning. In verse 10 it says, then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof that they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and of the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. And herein do I exercise myself, to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nations and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me, or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me, while I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called and questioned by you this day. And we'll stop right there. And so as I mentioned last week, chapter 24 here breaks down very easily into these three sections. You have the prosecution laid out by the Sanhedrin and their lawyer Tertullus. You have the defense of Paul given by himself here in the text that we just read. And the next week we'll see, I guess you could call it the verdict. There's not much of a verdict given, but we'll call it the verdict given by Felix. And so, like I said, it lays out like a typical court case, because honestly that's what it is. It is a very typical court case where one party is presenting kind of an emotional appeal, and one party, the defense, Paul, is presenting actual facts. And that's what we see in the text that we just read here today. So Paul, he's listened to the prosecution given against him. He knows the thinking of these men. He used to be one of these men. He knows how they operate, and he understands that they never really presented any actual evidence. It was all hearsay. In fact, there is no evidence that they could produce to actually substantiate the claims that they've been making against him. And so they relied on flattery. They relied on trumped-up emotional charges against Paul. And he's going to quickly dismiss these. We see that at the very beginning. He's going to quickly dismiss these charges with facts, and then he's going to get to the real heart of the issue, the real reason why he's there. Now, the reason that this particular group is charging him had really nothing to do with what he did to the temple. The reason this charges were brought against him, it had everything to do with what he taught. And really, beyond that, it had more so to do with the success with which he taught it. If Paul was just one man speaking to a group of uninterested listeners, they wouldn't really care, right? There would be no charges brought against him. He would not be in the position that he's in. No, they hate him because of what he teaches, and they hate him because of how successfully he's teaching it. He's getting followers, disciples all over the empire at this particular point. And so they hate him for this. Now, of course, we have the benefit of the New Testament. We understand that his success had much, much more to do with the Spirit than it had to do with him. In fact, he told the Corinthians that when he came to Corinth, he said, I came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom. Later he says, and my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Right? He specifically told the Corinthians, I'm nothing special, particularly when it comes to oration or preaching or giving a sermon. There's nothing special about Paul. He says the reason why it has any effect at all is because I came in the demonstration of the Spirit. Right? That the Spirit is speaking through me. And that gives power to the speech, not because of my wisdom or my intellect or my ability to turn a phrase. It has everything to do with the Spirit. However, I will say that Paul's willingness to endure and Paul's willingness to faithfully and boldly preach the truth, combined with the Spirit of the power, that is what drew the ire of those who were opposed to the truth. And here he makes that known. And also, don't miss throughout all of this that Felix is well aware of the interworkings of the Jews and the Sanhedrin and how he knows all this. He has, as Paul indicates here, we'll see in just a second, he's been in this position for a while. As we'll see, and I've mentioned, but we'll see it next week, he's married to a Jewish woman. And so Felix has, you could say, an intimate knowledge of these kinds of things. And so they're trying to pull the wool over a man's eyes who already kind of had the information before the wool was pulled. And so they're not going to be successful in this, and at least they're not going to get the outcome that they desire. Let's put it that way. And so back in verse 10, with all that context given, back in verse 10, it says, Then Paul, out of the governor, beckoned him to speak. He answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Now, there's a marked difference between the way that Paul begins and the way that Tertullus begins. What Paul says is no less appropriate. He still stands and gives a proper and appropriate introduction to the defense he's about to give, but he does so without lying flattery towards Felix. What he says is true. Basically, what he says is, Felix, you've been a judge a long time, and I'm real happy to have this opportunity to speak for myself. That's all true. Nothing that he said is a lie. And so he appropriately begins, and you can already see, just by the introduction in a strange way, you can see the manner in which Paul's going to give his defense and the manner in which the Sanhedrin presented their prosecution. Because what did they resort to? Flattery, lies, trumped-up charges, and you can see that from the very beginning. Paul stands upon the facts. Paul stands upon the truth because he's there representing the God of truth. And so he begins with a truth. And so he then begins to lay out the facts. And he doesn't waste any time. He just gets right to it. Verse 11. Because thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. And he's right. Everything he said is perfectly true. And so he said, it's only been 12 days. Now, we mentioned this last week, so I won't spend really any time here, but 12 days since he got to Jerusalem. We know that the process of him going with the Jews to the temple, that took 7 days, and it wasn't until the 7th day that mob and that riot broke out. And so all that has happened over the last couple of chapters since that original riot has only been 5 days. And so things have been moving rather quickly at that point. And so he calls out then the biggest hole in their case, which would be the biggest hole in any prosecution's case, is the simple fact that no one has actually seen Paul do any of the things that he's been accused of doing. They have no actual evidence to produce. They have no witnesses. They have nobody that they can bring forth to Felix to say it with any degree of honesty, I have seen Paul do these things. Here's the proof that he's actually guilty of what we're accusing him of doing. You can just think of the absurdity today of the prosecution, any prosecution, in a case today, trying to stand before the judge and say, here's what we're accusing him of, but we don't really have any evidence. We don't have a shred of evidence. No judge would take that case. It would be thrown out of court so fast. But this is exactly what they're trying to do. And so they had accused him of rousing up the Jews to sedition, to create some kind of insurrection, which, as we've discussed, they were very sensitive to at this time. Tensions were high. There were some insurrections kind of beginning at this particular point in time. So this was a threat that was taken very seriously, and the Jews knew that. They knew that if they accused somebody of that, that would get the ears of Rome. But they accused him of rousing the Jews to sedition and profaning the temple. That's what their accusations were. However, Paul says, they didn't find me in the temple disputing with anybody. They didn't find me raising up the people. They didn't find me doing that at the temple. They didn't find me doing that at the synagogues. They didn't find me doing that at the city. They didn't find me doing it at all. There's not any proof whatsoever that I have done anything of which I have been accused. And the reason we went back and read in chapter 21 is because who was it that actually did that? They're saying that he is the one causing sedition, causing this rising up, and yet it was the Jews who took him that caused the mob. It was the Jews who took him that caused a riot to form. And so if anybody is causing sedition, it's not Paul, it's those who are accusing him. And so, again, we can see where he stands upon the facts. And so these accusations are hearsay at best, complete fabrications at worst. And we understand exactly what they are. And so he lays it out straight. He says, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. Now, honestly, at this particular point, Paul could have just sat down. He could have sat down and said, case closed. But he doesn't stop there. He goes to the heart of the matter. That's what I mentioned a while ago. He doesn't just say, they have nothing against me, there's no proof, it's all hearsay, which he's right. And he could have stopped. But then he says, but hold on, this is why they're mad. Let's really talk about why I'm here. And so this is verse 14. He says, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. And so this is why they're mad. It has nothing to do with sedition. It has nothing to do with the temple. It has everything to do with I'm saying things that they disagree with. And like I mentioned earlier, it is growing in popularity. There are churches popping up all over. Christianity is spreading, and Paul's a big reason why. And so he gets to the real heart of the matter. Now, what is interesting is that he lays it out in the form of a confession. Right? Verse 14, but this I confess. Right? I have no crimes to confess to, but if there's a confession that needs to be made, it's this. I'm here because of my faith. That's why I'm here. I'm here because of what I believe, not because of any crime, not because of any wrongdoing. I'm here because of what I believe to be true. Now Paul and everyone in the room, for that matter, know full well he's there for his faith. They know this, but he's there because of the view of the way. Now we've talked about this already in the book of Acts. The way was their moniker for Christianity. That's what they called it. That's the way. The way believes this. The way believes in Jesus as the Messiah. And so the way they considered heresy. But Paul confesses that belief in the way, or Christianity in and of itself, is truly proper worship of the God that particular group accusing him claims to believe in. And so that's what he's saying. He says, the reason why I'm here is because I actually stand on truth. I actually believe the God that they claim to believe in. And if they actually believed in God, if they were honest in that, they'd be on my side, not accusing me. because I stand on truth. I stand on the side of God. And not just that, he says, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. I have God on my side, I have truth on my side, and I have the Scriptures on my side. And if you actually believed what you claim to believe, you would believe what I believe, because I have all things in my corner. God, the faith, and the Scriptures, all of it is leading people to believe what we believe as true. And so, what the Sanhedrin has labeled a Nazarene cult, we talked about that last week in verse 5, what they have labeled as a Nazarene cult are the one who are actually on the side of God and the Scriptures. And so remember, they're trying to say this is just some cultic sect of Judaism. It has nothing to do with us, and they're causing sedition. They're just dangerous cult followers, and they're going to be problems to Rome. You need to deal with it. And so Paul says what they're labeling a cult, that's actually true, biblical, honest truth. And so we have God on our side, we have the Scriptures on our side. Furthermore, by mentioning that his beliefs being in line with God and the Scriptures, but by mentioning this, what he's doing is he's indicating that what they believe is true, thus Jesus is actually the Messiah. You don't believe that. In fact, you crucified him, you killed him, but if we believe in the Scriptures, and the Scriptures are true, then Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah. And so the council would obviously disagree with this, but Paul is placing everything that he believes against the teaching and the beliefs of the Sanhedrin, and he's saying this is the issue at hand. It has nothing to do with sedition. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has everything to do with what we believe versus what they believe. And by the way, we differ, but we've got God and the Bible on our side. And so that's a pretty big difference. Let me quote John Phillips. He said, Paul did have something to confess. He confessed his absolute faith in divine revelation, in the law and the prophets, in the Hebrew Bible, and also that he differed from his accusers in the way he handled the Bible. He took it at its face value as the Word of God to be believed implicitly, interpreted literally, obeyed utterly. And so this is Paul saying, this is where I stand. If you disagree with me, you disagree with that. If you disagree with me, you disagree with God. If you disagree with me, you disagree with the law. You disagree with the prophets. You have nothing defending your position. Not facts, not theology, not God, not the Scriptures, none of it. You have nothing to present your side. Now, what he does next is a little bit interesting, because he actually places himself somewhat in line with the council. And he does this, I believe, for a very specific reason. But look at verse 15. He says, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. And so he says this is something we actually believe in solidarity, that there will be a resurrection of God, both of the just and the unjust. Now, Ananias, who was there, Ananias, the high priest, the head of the Sanhedrin, as was typical with most of the high priests, was a Sadducee. We've discussed all this. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. They had odd beliefs on angels and spiritual things that matter. But most of the Sanhedrin were Pharisees. And like I mentioned last week, we don't know how many of the Sanhedrin was there. We know some of them were there. There was a contingent of the Sanhedrin that was there. And so I think the safe assumption is that most of them there would have been Pharisees. And so Paul says, listen, I agree with them on this particular matter, that there is a hope of the resurrection, that there was going to be the resurrection of the just and the unjust. And by the way, that is very clearly taught in the Old Testament, nowhere more clear in Daniel chapter 12, when Daniel says that some will be raised and there will be a resurrection to life, a resurrection to death, essentially is what he says. These things are clearly taught in the Old Testament. But here's why I believe he's saying this. It makes it a whole lot harder for the Sanhedrin to stand up and say, this is a dangerous theological cult, when Paul says, we agree on some stuff. We agree on this. This is the reason why I'm here, ultimately. And by the way, we agree on some of this. So it makes it a whole lot harder to say they're not biblical, they're not on the side of God, they're just a dangerous cult, when at the end of the day, Paul's saying here, but hold on, if this is the reason why I'm here, and he said this before them when he met before the Sanhedrin, why am I here? Because of what I teach about the resurrection. And we agree about the resurrection. It makes it a whole lot harder for them to make their argument. Darrell Bach, he said, the law here is seen in terms of redemption, salvation, and promise. That is, in terms of eschatological deliverance. It is hope. And in fact, that's the word that Paul uses. It is hope The new movement, and here's the key, the new movement, the way, Christianity, the new movement is actually rooted in old promises, a sign that it should be respected as an appropriate reflection of Jewish hope. It is no subversive movement, right? And so here's what Paul's doing. There's two things going on. You claim we're this way out there, religious cult, but we agree on this. We agree on the main reason why I'm here. But also, everything that I'm saying and teaching is born out of the scriptures you uphold to be true. It is born out of Old Testament hope. Now, that Old Testament hope is seen most clearly in light of what Jesus did. It is seen most clearly in light of Calvary. The New Testament bears light upon the Old. But everything that he believes is born out of and is not contradictory to the Old Testament. And so what he's saying here essentially is that you claim, again, we're this out-of-the-line Jewish sect that's just a cult, a Nazarene cult, but everything we believe is directly in line with the Scriptures. If you want to make the claim that we're going against the grain and that we're cultish, you're going to have to prove that what we teach and what we believe cannot be proven biblically. And of course, they couldn't, because everything that Paul taught could be proven biblically. Now, Paul doesn't actually go into any detail here on the resurrection. He doesn't explain the resurrection. He doesn't talk about the theological implications of the resurrection. All he says is verse 15, we have hope towards God, which they themselves also allowed, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. And herein do I exercise myself, to always have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. And so he doesn't go into a theological treatise on the resurrection and what that means and the implications of it all. I think there's probably two reasons. Number one, it's really unnecessary at the time, but also, number two, I think most people in the room had an understanding of his position. I think the Sanhedrin, whom he had already stood before and talked about this, had an understanding, but also Felix. We know that Felix understood this. Just to look ahead at verse 22, it says, and when Felix heard these things, it says this, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them. And so Felix understands Christianity. He's not a Christian. He doesn't believe it, but he understands it. He understands Christianity. He understands Judaism. Felix he knows all this. Essentially, there's really not much that Paul could say that Felix wouldn't have already known. And so he doesn't go into a full explanation of the resurrection here. And so this is the same argument that Paul made before the Sanhedrin. And so this is the same argument Paul made. And if you remember, this is why there was such an argument and a fight broke out before the Sanhedrin, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees started fighting one another over what Paul said about the resurrection. But it was in the midst of that kind of the chaos and almost confusion that Paul was proclaimed innocent. Back in the last chapter, verse 9, it said, and there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, we find no evil in this man. And so, again, it makes sense why Paul would bring this up. Felix understands resurrections. He understands the theological side of this. But also, resurrection is the biggest reason why I'm here. It's one of the foundations of my teaching. It's a foundation of the gospel, so it makes sense that would be a foundation of his teaching. It was specifically that particular truth that caused the very ones accusing him to stand up and say, there's nothing wrong with what he's done. This guy is innocent. We find no evil in this man. And so Paul is just hitting them at every possible point, and showing you not only have no proof, you have no true accusation to bring, but for the real reason why I'm here, you proclaimed me innocent. So why am I here? What's the point of all this? And so he's done a good job defending himself. Now, after laying out these facts, he says, and herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. Now, we looked at this a little bit last week, but this is exactly what Peter says we should do when we suffer for Christ. 1 Peter 3:16, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak evil of you as of evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ, or your good attitude, your good actions, your good conduct in Christ. And so that's exactly what they're doing. And Paul he said, a clean conscience. I have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. So what does he mean by that? He's used this terminology before. And the same thing here as it was then. He's not claiming sinlessness. Paul is not saying, I have never sinned since my salvation. Since Christ saved me and redeemed me and justified me and cleansed me, I have never once sinned. That's not what he's claiming. The Bible doesn't teach this. What he is saying is that Paul has done nothing that would lead to the situation he's in. Paul has done nothing that would lead to an arrest. He's done nothing that would lead to bonds. He's done nothing that would lead to imprisonment. And so the charges that they're bringing, they're faulty on every level. I have done nothing that would lead to this, and I'm only being tried for faithfully and obediently following God and the Scriptures. That's why I'm being tried. And so essentially what he's saying is, if I'm being tried for that, and if you can admit that, that's fine. But I have done nothing that would cause this. I am clean. I have a clean conscience with all things regarding this particular trial and the offenses laid out against me, as weak as they were. And so he closes his argument here in verse 17. He says, Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me, or else let those same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me when I stood before the council, except to be for this one voice, that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called and questioned by you this day. And so it kind of explains how he got into this whole situation, and it kind of turns everything on the head of the Sanhedrin. It began not by him causing sedition among the Jews, which was their accusation, but by him bringing an offering to help the Jews. Right? I didn't cause sedition. I came to help. In fact, not just me, but all those Gentile churches that you hate so much, we gathered up an offering to come and help the Jews here or not here, they're in Caesarea, but to help the Jews in Jerusalem. And so it was at this point that he says, certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, get that, found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult. And so again, no sedition. I'm not causing a problem. Not only did I not bring Gentiles into the temple as they claimed earlier, but I was purified. I was following the law. I was doing everything that I was supposed to be doing as a Jewish person in that particular place at that time. There was literally nothing that I was doing that everybody else there that day wasn't also doing. Right? There was no reason to call me out. There was no reason for any of this to happen. And so he's at the temple following the proper procedures. He's not profaning the temple. They found him purified in the temple. Right? And so this is completely against what they had claimed. He was not causing an uprising. He was there in support of Jews following Jewish law. Right? That's the whole reason that they found him there in the first place. And so he then points out the obvious, which is the Jews who first made the accusations against Paul and who are the ones who actually caused the uproar at the temple, they should have been there to make their argument. Right? And so essentially he says, I'm standing here before the Sanhedrin, but where are my actual accusers? The Sanhedrin represents my accusers. They are not my actual accusers. They are not the one who started the mob. They're not the ones who dragged me, and Claudius had to take me away from them. Where are they? They should be here to I have a right, not only as just a human, but as a Roman citizen, to have my actual accusers stand here in court in front of me and make their accusations. And he did have that right. Now we don't know really why they didn't come. We do know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but the reason is because there are no real charges to make. They have no real accusations to bring. However, the point that Paul is making here, and the reason he brings it up, is because in Roman society, it was really greatly looked down upon for the accusers not to show up if things went to trial. If things went to court and the accusers didn't show up, this was seen as shameful and not something that should be done. In fact, there's a Roman historian by the name of Suetonius. He writes about a lot of the first emperors, and there in his section about Claudius, who was emperor at this time, he writes this about Claudius. He says, whenever one party to a suit was absent, he was prone to decide in favor of the one who was present without considering whether his opponent had failed to appear through his own fault or from a necessary cause. And so when Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, was hearing a case, if the accusers weren't present, even if they had a legitimate reason to not be there, Claudius was prone to just say, well, you know what? They lose the case. You're here, they're not. Case goes in your favor. And so it was looked down upon in Roman society for the accusers not to be there. And so essentially Paul brings this up because it's just another point in his favor. It's just another point that shows this whole thing is a facade and should never have taken place to begin with. And so then Paul throws the burden of proof back upon the Sanhedrin. Right? Paul had already stood before them, and as we've seen, was already proclaimed innocent by them. And yet here they are again, trying to make accusations against him. And so he simply calls for Felix to examine them. Right? Or let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council. Right? I've been before them. They have tried me. And what was the result of that? We find no evil in this man. That was the result of that particular trial. Right? So what has come up in the few days that have passed since then, that whereas they said that then, now they are accusing me again. And so essentially Paul is saying the only thing that he is guilty of is, quote unquote, inciting the council. Not causing sedition among the Jews abroad, but inciting the very council, because he stood up and he talked about the resurrection, and they all got mad and started fighting one another. Right? That's the only inciting that has been done. However, the only reason that happened is because Paul claimed his questioning was because of his belief in the resurrection. And again, he's right. This is the strongest argument that they could make because Paul was an innocent man. The strongest argument that they said, in the words of Paul, the best argument that they could bring for you is that I caused, quote unquote, sedition in the Sanhedrin. But the only way that I caused sedition is because I stood up and I talked about the resurrection, and then they got mad and they started fighting with one another. I really had nothing to do with it. To quote Constable, he said, Paul's present accusers could not even testify that the Sanhedrin had found him guilty when he appeared before that body. The only point of disagreement had been his belief about the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, Paul concluded he was on trial over the issue of the resurrection. This put Felix in the awkward position of having to decide a theological issue over which his Jewish subjects disagreed. Right? And so, in other words, Paul set himself up in the best possible position that you could be in for the judge to come down in your favor. Now, we'll see next week how that turns out. But Paul here had defended himself honestly. He had defended himself shrewdly. He had defended himself humbly. He has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt his innocence, and he has defended the truth of the resurrection as a biblical doctrine. And as I mentioned earlier, not only the truth of the resurrection, but the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. Because if Paul and the Christians are the ones actually on the side of God in the Scriptures, and they believe that Jesus was the Messiah, was perfect, was killed, buried, resurrected again, if they believed all that, and they're right, then he has defended the fact that not only is the resurrection true, but Jesus is God, and Jesus is the Messiah. And so all of that was on trial in this. All of that was on trial. And Paul proved without a shadow of doubt that it was all true. In other words, all that he has done so honorably. This is especially impressive considering the circumstances, considering why he is where he is. I'll quote William Barclay here. He said, "There never emerged the accents of self-pity or of bitterness which would have been so natural in a man whose finest actions had been so cruelly and deliberately misinterpreted and misstated." For a good while now, everything that Paul has done and said has been taken by those who are opposed by him and, to use his words, misinterpreted and misstated, and it has led him to be falsely imprisoned. It has led him to now be tried before Felix. It's going to lead him to be tried all the way before Rome. But Paul knows and understands that this is all the will of God. Paul knows and understands that God is bringing him to Rome. Now, he's bringing him to Rome in chains, but he's getting him to Rome because God wants the gospel to go there, and not just to Rome, but to places in Rome where it would not have gone otherwise. And we know, based upon Paul's other writings, particularly that of the book of Philippians, that it was successful. That it was successful. I've pointed this out before, but when Paul writes the book of Philippians, he says that they of Caesar's household greet you. Well, why would Caesar's household greet the Philippians? Because now there's believers in Caesar's household that would not have had the opportunity, probably, to hear the gospel outside of the fact that God got Paul into a situation where he could give them the gospel. And so I'll close by saying this. This is something I mentioned several chapters ago, but I wanted to bring it up again here because I think it's more evident maybe here than anywhere else in this whole closing section, I guess you could say, of the book of Acts, which is we emphasize Paul's defense of himself, and as we just said, he did a fantastic job defending himself. But it is a sad fact that he had to do it himself. In other words, it's a sad thing that Paul stands here being tried for the things he's being tried for, and there's not a single other Christian by his side. There's not another man standing there with Paul as he's being accused of things that he didn't do. And as we just talked about, ultimately the gospel was on trial. And yet nobody was there with him. Now, I think there's a good reason why somebody like Luke wasn't with him. I think Luke and Paul had a tremendous relationship. I think they both loved one another greatly. I think Luke would have been there in an instant, but you also got to remember one of the things that Paul was being accused of was bringing Gentiles into the temple. So it probably wouldn't have been the smartest thing to have a Gentile there with him. We know that later on, when Paul is on trial again, that he writes to Timothy, everybody has forsaken me, only Luke is with me. And so I have no reason to believe that Luke wouldn't have been there in an instant at this particular point, but there are probably overriding circumstances that led to him not being there. My real problem is the fact that people from that Jerusalem church weren't with him. My real problem is that you don't have somebody like James standing up with Paul, showing solidarity not only for the church at large, but for the gospel before a man as important as Felix and in the position that Felix was in. And so for all Paul had done for the church in Jerusalem, like we mentioned, gathering that offering, Paul was under no compulsion to do that. Those Gentile churches were under no compulsion. There was no commandment given by God through the apostles that said, everybody in Corinth and everybody in Thessalonica and all these other churches, you must take an offering and you must give it to the... They were under no compulsion. They did it out of genuine love and conviction for their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. It didn't matter to them if they were Jew or Gentile. There was financial problems, and they could help solve them. And so they gave out of the goodness of their heart. Paul went through a great deal to gather that offering and to deliver it to Jerusalem. And in doing all that, as soon as he gets to Jerusalem, he's met immediately with accusations, and not even by the outside world, by the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem for which they were bringing the offering. The first thing he runs into is problems with the ones he's there to help. And yet now he stands in his greatest hour of need, and none of them are anywhere to be found. I mean, think about it. And again, I'm not trying to put down James. I mean, James. We're talking about the author of the book of James. We're talking about the half-brother of Jesus, the very leader of the church of Jerusalem. I'm not trying to diminish what this man did, and he did great things for the cause of Christ, and we all recognize that. But again, that doesn't mean he's perfect. He should have been there. James was a very well-known person. He was a well-known Jew. His testimony would have carried some influence. His testimony probably would have helped somewhat. Who most certainly could have helped were those 4 men who had the vow for whom Paul was paying and helped them that very week that he was at the temple. You know who could have cleared up the confusion if Paul had brought Gentiles into that temple? Were the guys who were there with him. They could have cleared up some of that confusion. And guess where they were? Nowhere to be found. And so here Paul, standing in trial for things he didn't do, and ultimately defending the gospel and the truth of the resurrection, no other Christian is there willing to stand beside him. Now, again, I don't want to take this farther than it needs to be. Like I said, maybe there were some extenuating circumstances. But at the end of the day, here's what we know. Here's Paul defending himself because nobody else is there to do it. And so, again, this is a very sad aspect about this whole scene, this whole closing several chapters of the book of Acts, is that Paul is doing it, and he's doing it all without the help of anybody else. And so here at the lowest point in his life, Paul was alone. However, and in all things, he was willing to endure for the one who had endured far more for him. Paul was willing to carry his cross because Jesus had gone to the cross for him. Paul was willing to do all this. He was willing to endure. He was willing to go through whatever it was that God had called for him to endure and to go through. And I'll close with this thought. He may not have had a man by his side. James may not have been there. Those 4 Jews may not have been there. Luke may not have been there at this particular time. But Paul well knew the words and believed the words of Hebrews 13, where we read, "For he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, The Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Let's pray.